Hey everyone and welcome. We're about to take a deep dive into active citizenship in Canada. You've given us some really interesting sources, and it looks like you're especially interested in how things have changed since the 1960s.
Yeah, a lot has happened. It's a pretty dynamic period in Canadian history.
Totally. So we're going to explore everything from immigration and multiculturalism to Indigenous rights and the efforts to preserve Francophone identity.
It's quite a tapestry, and it's all connected to how Canadians engage with their society and government.
There's even this intriguing story about a town that refused to fade away. But first, let's rewind a bit and talk about Canada's transformation from a primarily bicultural nation to a multicultural society.
Right, so before World War II, immigration policy was really focused on reinforcing Canada's British and French roots.
So European immigrants were favored, basically.
Yeah, pretty much. It was all about maintaining that bicultural foundation. But after the war, things started to change. Canada's economy was booming. They needed skilled workers.
And relying solely on, British and French immigrants wasn't going to cut it.
Exactly. Plus, the world was changing too. Colonial empires were crumbling, new nations were emerging, and Canada couldn't ignore these global shifts.
So how did Canada adapt its immigration policies to keep up with these changing times?
Well, that's where the point system comes in.
Ah, the point system. Tell me more about that.
So it was introduced in the 1960s to be more objective and to attract skilled immigrants from a wider range of countries.
Wider than just Europe, you mean?
Yeah, exactly. The system evaluated potential immigrants based on things like education, language skills, work experience, and adaptability.
So suddenly where you were from mattered less than what you could bring to Canada.
Right. Your potential contribution to Canadian society became the key factor.
Wow, that's a pretty big shift. It makes you think about what it would be like to arrive in a new country and be judged on your skills rather than your passport.
Yeah, it was a radical departure from the old system, and it had a huge impact on Canada's demographics. It led to a much more diverse and multicultural society.
But I imagine not everyone was thrilled about this move towards a more diverse Canada. Was there any pushback?
Oh, for sure. Some folks were worried about how this influx of newcomers would affect Canada's cultural identity.
They probably thought it would dilute Canadian culture.
Yeah, some people felt that way. And others, while they supported the idea of diversity, questioned whether the point system was really as objective as it claimed to be.
Like, could it still be biased against certain groups? Even unintentionally?
Exactly. For example, people without formal education or from countries with different educational systems might be at a disadvantage.
It makes sense that a change this big would spark debate. So, how did Canada navigate these complexities and ultimately embrace multiculturalism as an official policy?
Well, a key step was the Immigration Act of 1978.
Okay, what did that do?
It made it easier for skilled workers to immigrate, for families to reunite, and for refugees to seek safety in Canada.
So it really solidified that shift towards a more inclusive immigration policy.
Exactly. And this act paved the way for the official multiculturalism policy adopted in 1971. This policy recognized and celebrated the diverse cultures that we're now calling Canada home.
It's amazing how one policy can have such a ripple effect, shaping the very fabric of a nation.
Absolutely. But it's important to remember that the story of multiculturalism in Canada is an ongoing one.
You mean it didn't just solve all the issues around diversity and inclusion overnight?
Right. While the policy was generally well received, there were still debates about how effective it was and whether it actually promoted unity or just led to different cultural groups living in isolation from each other.
So the question became, how do you balance promoting diversity with nurturing a sense of national unity? A tricky balance.
It was, and still is. One of your sources actually has a really insightful quote from Lillian Tu, a Chinese community leader in Vancouver. She said, "Multiculturalism is not about songs and dances. It is an affirmation of the right of those Canadians whose heritage is neither French nor English, 40% of our population, to be participants in the mainstream of Canadian life."
Wow, that's powerful. It shifts the focus from preserving a singular cultural identity to creating a space where everyone can belong and contribute, regardless of their background.
Exactly. And that's the ongoing challenge and opportunity of multiculturalism, figuring out how everyone fits into this evolving Canadian mosaic.
And speaking of evolving, Our next stop on this deep dive takes us to the rights and experiences of Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, and we can't talk about Canadian citizenship without acknowledging the historical injustices faced by Indigenous communities and their fight for self-determination.
Yeah, it feels like we're moving from one complex layer of this Canadian mosaic to another. One thing that really struck me in your research was the significant growth of First Nations and Inuit communities since the 1920s.
It's pretty remarkable when you consider that the Indigenous population had been in decline for such a long time before that.
It is, and there's this particularly notable surge in the youth population, too.
Exactly. That's what makes it even more interesting. This growing youth population brings so much energy and potential for cultural revitalization, you know?
It's definitely encouraging to hear about this resurgence, especially after learning about the historical injustices they've faced. But this population growth must come with its own set of challenges too, right?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, it's great to see this growth, but it also highlights the need for increased resources.
Like what kind of resources?
Well, everything. Education, healthcare, housing, economic opportunities, you name it. The key is ensuring that these communities have what they need to truly thrive, not just get by.
It makes you think, like, what if you had the power to address those needs directly? To be in control of your own future.
And that brings us to the heart of the issue, self-government.
Right, self-government. It's a term we hear a lot, but what does it actually mean in practice for Indigenous communities?
Well, it's not a simple answer. It's complex. For many Indigenous communities, self-government isn't about separating from Canada entirely.
It's not like full independence.
Right. It's more about reclaiming control over their lands, resources, and their own governance systems. It's about having the power to make decisions that directly affect their lives.
So things like education, healthcare, economic development, and cultural preservation.
All of that. And it's not about receiving something from the Canadian government. It's about asserting a right that they believe is already theirs.
So it's about recognizing inherent rights that predate European settlement.
Exactly. Rights that were often ignored or suppressed throughout history.
It sounds like a pretty fundamental shift in the power dynamic, really.
Yeah.
So has there been any progress on this front? Like, how has this push for self-government played out in reality?
Well, it's been a long road. But there have been significant steps forward. For example, the Assembly of First Nations has been a crucial voice.
They were founded in the 1980s, right, to advocate for Indigenous rights at the national level.
Yeah, and they've been really pushing for the recognition of self-government. And while there's still a long way to go, there have been some important successes.
Like what? Can you give me an example?
Sure. One really significant example is the Nunavut Agreement.
Oh, yeah, I've heard of that. That was back in 1993, right?
Yep. And it led to the creation of the territory of Nunavut in 1999.
Which gave the Inuit people of Nunavut a lot more control over their own affairs.
A lot more. Including control over land and resources. It was a landmark agreement.
It sounds like it. It could even be a model for other Indigenous communities.
It definitely could be, but it's important to remember that the journey to self-determination is different for each community.
Right, of course. One size doesn't fit all.
Exactly. The specific models and agreements vary based on the unique history and cultural context of each nation. Some communities might want more control within the existing Canadian framework. Others might be pushing for a nation-to-nation relationship with the Canadian government.
It's complex.
Yeah.
But what's clear is that this idea of active citizenship takes on a whole new meaning in this context. It goes beyond just voting or volunteering. It's about asserting inherent rights and fighting for control over your destiny.
Absolutely. And speaking of asserting rights and cultural heritage, our next stop takes us to the Frankophone communities outside Quebec. They've also had their own struggles with maintaining their language and culture within a largely English-speaking country.
It must be a constant battle against assimilation in many ways.
It can be, but it also shows the strength and determination of these communities to hold on to their heritage.
And to be fair, Canada has taken steps to recognize the importance of both official languages.
Yeah, the Official Languages Act of 1969 was a big moment for that.
It guaranteed services in both English and French at the federal level.
Right, yeah, that's right. So in theory, the federal government is officially bilingual.
That sounds like a victory. Did it solve everything?
Well, not quite. While the Act set a national standard, things still vary quite a bit from province to province.
So even within a country that promotes bilingualism, there are still places where preserving a language and culture is an uphill battle.
Unfortunately, yes. And one of the biggest challenges for Francophone communities outside of Quebec has been access to education in their own language.
I see. So Francophone schools become really important.
Oh, absolutely crucial. They're vital for passing on traditions and fostering a strong sense of identity, but they've often been underfunded.
And I imagine they've faced pressure to just assimilate into the English-speaking majority.
Exactly. And one of your sources actually talks about the importance of Francophone schools. When Francophone students walk through the doors of the school, they feel at home. By identifying with the community of the school, students also bond with the larger Francophone community. When a community stays vital, so does its language.
It's powerful, isn't it? The school is a safe haven, a place where language and culture can actually flourish. It shows that preserving cultural heritage is a form of active citizenship in itself.
It really is. It's about actively shaping the future you want for your community. And speaking of shaping the future, maybe we should shift gears and talk about that major shift from rural to urban life in Canada.
Yeah, okay. Let's picture Canada after World War II. The country is changing, cities are booming, and people are moving from rural areas to urban centers in droves, looking for new opportunities.
That's it. It was a time of huge transformation. A lot of factors contributed to it.
Like what? What drove this urban shift?
Well, there were more jobs in cities, new industries popping up, plus advancements in agriculture meant that fewer people were needed to work on farms. And a lot of new immigrants chose to settle in cities as well.
So it was a combination of things, really.
Yeah, it was a perfect storm for urbanization.
Ah,
And it had a big impact on both rural and urban communities.
I bet. I could just picture those images, the bustling factories, the growing skylines. But what about the folks who stayed behind in rural Canada? What happened to all those small towns as people moved away?
Well, for a lot of them, it was a tough time.
They struggled to survive.
Yeah. Shrinking populations, businesses closing, schools shutting down. A lot of rural communities experienced a real sense of decline.
It's like progress for some came at the expense of others.
In a way, yeah. There were definitely efforts to support rural communities, but it was, and still is, a complex issue. Some communities tried to adapt, diversify their economies.
Maybe focus on things like tourism or new industries.
Exactly. Others tried to preserve their heritage and their unique way of life, hoping to attract visitors with that small-town charm.
So some adapted and thrived while others struggled. It's a story that reflects the bigger challenges facing Canada as a whole, trying to create a society where everyone can belong and succeed. Speaking of success stories, you mentioned a town that refused to become another statistic, right?
Right. Rowley, Alberta. Now that's a story of resilience.
Tell me more. What's so special about Rowley?
Well, Rowley was like a lot of small towns. It was facing those same challenges we talked about, Young people were moving away to bigger cities for more opportunities, and agriculture was changing.
And as people left, Rowley's population was shrinking.
Exactly. And when the population shrinks, businesses start closing, buildings get abandoned, and this whole feeling of decline just sets in.
It can be hard to break out of that cycle.
It can. A lot of people might have just given up, but the folks in Rowley, they decided to do something about it.
They took matters into their own hands.
That's right. They really harnessed this spirit of, collective action.
So what do they do? How do they turn things around?
Well, they got creative. They started by restoring their old heritage buildings and turning them into tourist attractions.
Oh, that's a cool idea.
Yeah, like their old railway station.
Hmm.
They turned it into a museum to showcase Rowley's history. They even reopened an old-fashioned saloon.
A saloon.
Yeah.
That's fun.
Right. It was all about celebrating their past, but also creating new opportunities for the future. They basically turned their town into a living museum.
So they used their history to attract visitors and boost their economy. That's pretty clever.
It was. And you know what? It worked. People loved it. They were drawn to Rowley's charm and its authentic character.
And that sense of hope,
Yeah.
this little town that refused to give up.
Exactly. Tourists started coming, businesses reopened. Rowley actually became this symbol of hope for other rural communities that were struggling.
It's a great example of what can happen when people come together and work towards a common goal.
Absolutely. So we've covered a lot of ground in this deep dive into active citizenship in Canada. We've talked about immigration, multiculturalism, Indigenous rights, Frankophone identity, and even the challenges facing rural communities. It's been quite a journey.
It has. And through it all, one theme keeps coming up: the power of active citizenship. Whether it's individuals standing up for their rights, communities working together to preserve their heritage, or towns like Rowley fighting for their future, Canadians are shaping their country in so many ways.
It's really inspiring. It shows that active citizenship isn't just a concept. It's about real people making a real difference.
Exactly. And it's something we can all be a part of. No matter who we are or where we come from, we can all contribute to making Canada a more just, inclusive, and vibrant place.
So as we wrap things up, I'd encourage everyone listening to think about what active citizenship means to you. What are you passionate about? What changes do you want to see in your community or in Canada as a whole?
And what small step can you take today to make a difference? It doesn't have to be something huge. Every action, no matter how small, can contribute to a better future.
Absolutely. So go out there and be the change you want to see in Canada.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you learned something new and feel inspired to get involved. Until next time, keep exploring and stay curious.